Hey everybody, welcome to the next Kubernetes happy hour. Today we're going to be talking about RBAC again. RBAC was something we talked about maybe a couple months ago. I'm going to give you a brief history of what RBAC is in Kubernetes. So RBAC was called role-based access control. And what role-based access control, I'm going to use it today in the context of users trying to get access to resources inside your cluster. Um, so there's four basic things we're going to talk about today. The first thing is a cluster role. So a cluster role is a role that you can give to a user that is cluster wide. So a cluster is broken up into many namespaces, and across those namespaces is the cluster level. So the cluster role, if you have a cluster role, it applies to all the namespaces on the cluster. So the cluster role binding is the next primitive we're going to talk about. So the cluster role binding is the mechanism whereby you take the role, and the role has all the permissions that you like to give across the entire cluster, and give them to individual users, service accounts, applications. And today we're going to be talking about users. So the example I'm going to show you, I'm going to go talk about cluster roles and cluster role bindings. The two other primitives are roles and role bindings, and those are namespace specific as opposed to cluster roles and cluster role bindings, which are cluster wide permissions resources. So what we're going to talk about today is something new in Kubernetes 1.9 called role aggregations. So this is really cool for me because in the past I've had to write scripts to be able to implement RBAC across the cluster. Um, so there's some basic built-in cluster roles in Kubernetes. One of them is called the admin. Another one is called view. So if you want to keep things simple, you just reuse those built-in cluster roles. So if you have admins, you give them the admin view. If you have users that just need to read stuff, you give them the built-in cluster read view. Now the problem comes into play when you have things like CRDs. So we talked about CRDs before in the past, what CRD is a custom resource definition or an extension to the Kubernetes API where you want to represent some kind of state and you want to build operators that act on that state when things change, get created or deleted. So that's the mechanism whereby you extend the Kubernetes API. It's used in some places like Prometheus or something called a service monitor, which describes how you want to actually monitor a specific service or group of services. Prometheus is another common example of a CRD, which lets you define how you want to deploy Prometheus when it gets instantiated, what kind of configuration you want to give it, how to discover its rules files, how to discover services that are out there in the cluster, what to use for service discovery of those services. Another one is another CRD is certificates. So a certificate is a way that you can go and define how you integrate with um, CAs inside your cluster and how you issue certificates and how they get renewed. We use it for Let's Encrypt. So you have a couple examples there of what CRDs are. Today I'm going to go back to my CRD example that I ran maybe a couple months ago too, dealing with fans. I made this thing called a fan, like a sports fan, typical CRD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this sports fan. I'm going to show you guys how we can gain access to the CRD. So the problem, back to the four primitives with RBAC. So you have this cluster role, right? And one of them is called admin. Another one is called view. The problem is that these built-in roles don't know about CRDs, so they don't have access to the CRDs, right? Because it's something that I create. I create a CRD. Kubernetes doesn't know about it. So in order for me to give the admins permissions to see these CRDs, if you're using RBAC, you have to go through, well, the old way before 1.9, what you'd have to do is you have to create a new cluster role, and then you'd have to go to all the namespaces in your cluster, and you'd have to exhaustively give permissions for all the users and all those namespaces access to the custom resource definition. So it was like kind of exhaustive and time consuming. So with 1.9, you have this new thing called law or role aggregations. So I could take the admin role, which is a cluster-wide role, and I can aggregate new permissions to it on the fly. So I can reuse that built-in role. I don't have to create new cluster roles whenever I want to create a new CRD, or whenever I need access to another resource that's not part of that admin view or any other built-in cluster-wide role. So the example today I'm going to go through, I'm going to show you guys. I'm going to make the CRD. I'm going to flip-flop between me being the administrator of the cluster and me being my personal user of the cluster. And I'm going to show you how I don't have access out of the box to CRDs. And I'm going to go through, I'm going to show you guys how you do log aggregation. And I'm going to show you me having access to those CRDs. And that'll be it for today. I just wanted to show you guys this because for me, it's something that I'm going to take advantage of immediately, because I want to get out of the pattern of having to exhaustively go through for every namespace and create a role binding in every namespace to tie to the new cluster role that I have to make for all these CRDs. So now I could just reuse the same cluster role and call it a day. So in the future, if I have a new CRD, all I have to do is a log aggregation to add that new CRD to the cluster roles that already exist, that are already bound to those users in those namespaces. So I could just aggregate to them and I don't have to redefine anything, right? It'll just work. I just have to update one spot as opposed to n different spots, n being the different namespaces out there that I have to update. So that's the power of it. It makes management of these RBAC policies a little bit easier. RBAC is something that it's kind of hard to manage, but Helm helps out a lot, because Helm helps you go through and automate a lot of the generation of all those policies. So we have a specific Helm chart that just deals with project-based management. And one of my coworkers, Bismarck, actually sent me a link to guys from Etsy who were doing something very similar to how we do things here at Vonage, which was kind of encouraging, because it's good to see that we didn't know about each other and we kind of ended up at the same conclusion in our implementations and how we did stuff, which is kind of exciting. So there's definitely need for project management, open source project out there for Kubernetes to manage your RBAC. But it's cool to know that we were both using Helm. Us and the Etsy guys were both using Helm to go through and manage projects, users on projects, and which namespaces the users have access to. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, I'm only going to use my terminal. I don't think I need my browser or Eclipse or anything like that. So I'm going to use my terminal. I'm going to show you guys the CRD. So we'll just go over CRDs really quick. Bring up my terminal. Okay, so I'm in my CRD thing here. I just want to make sure, so I have two users. I have my user and I have the admin user. And what we're going to do, when I see this means this use user here. I have a macro in my shell script which lets me switch to user for my current Kubernetes context. So I can switch my user to the admin user, which I am right there. So what I want to do is I want to show you guys the old way of doing stuff. So let's see if I do the cluster role. Give me all the cluster role bindings. You can see that we have a whole bunch of different cluster role bindings. And with a new way of doing this, I don't think we need all these cluster role bindings. So we have this thing here called admins binding, right? And this admins binding is going to bind to a cluster role. Let's not do the admin binding. Let's do another binding. Let's do the core services. Where are you here? Binding. Let's do that, because I think that my example is built around this one. So we're going to do kubectl, get cluster role binding, core service binding, and we're going to put it out into JSON. Okay. So let's. I spelled binding wrong. Okay, so this is a cluster role binding. You can see, so again, a binding is taking users or subjects. It could be a user, it could be an OIDC user like we have here, or it could be a service account or something else. You see, these people have the view, these cluster roles. So these guys are all going to be assigned a cluster role view inside this cluster role binding. And what happens is this cluster role binding is given to all the different namespaces. So I have to do it n different times, right? So, okay, so with that, in the absence of role aggregation, you have this view, and I'm not allowed to add on to view. So if I come along with a new CRD, I need to look at a different role binding. Let me just do get cluster role binding. Let me find the CRD one. Oh. So I'm going to go through all the namespaces. I'm going to find the CRD. Well, so you have to see this thing here. This is what I'll talk about. For every time in a new namespace, I'd have to go and create this this role binding in the namespace for something like a CRD. So I'm going to open up one of these role bindings for you, okay? And then you can see what I'm talking about. I guess the picture is worth 1,000 words. So let's take this first one here, this one, okay? And he's in the namespace core services tiller, okay? And let's look at it. Okay, so the role binding, what it does, it takes the list of users again, and it takes actually the service account here. So you can see that the binding doesn't have to be just users. It can be like a service account, which is service account in Kubernetes, again, is a way for an application to identify itself. Okay, so what we're going to here is going to a cluster role called the CRD tiller role. And the CRD tiller role has that CRD name in it, so that's called a cluster role, right? So we're going to go to get the cluster role. It's going to be CRD tiller role. Okay, so you can see in this this role, which is a cluster role, I called it the CRD tiller role. And what it does is it goes through and it gives access to certificates, to sealed secrets. Oh, that's another big one. That's another CRD, a sealed secret. Here's a basic one that's not part of the admin view, which is network policies. That's also not part of there. Resource quotas are not part of there. So there's some things that sometimes, you know, out of the box, these built-in roles, you'd like to add on to them. In most cases, you are going to want to add on to them. So you can see I had to go and create this separate thing on the side here. And what I had to do was I had to go and apply it to all these different namespaces and different times. So these guys, so I had to go create this different role, and I had to go actually go and bind it every time to all these different namespaces. And I had to do that actually for every group of users that I cared about, which can get really crazy. Let's say if you have 1,000 teams working on something, then I have to do this 1,000 times, and it's just not feasible. So log aggregation, or role aggregation, I want to say log aggregation, role aggregation to the rescue will solve all that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can go about not needing to do this n different times for every team. So it's really a product of the number of teams you have times the number of namespaces you want those teams to have access to, which can get kind of out of control if you have many teams operating within your cluster. Okay, so let's go back. And I am the admin user from before. I switched my user to the admin user. And I think I actually already ran this thing, so what I want to do, use a namespace test, okay. I'll do kubectl get roles in tests, and give me role binding in tests. Okay, kubectl. I get no roles, no role. I have a cluster role and a cluster role aggregate, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. So let's look at the cluster role first. So the way this works is that you create a new cluster role, or you can reuse an existing cluster role, right? And what you do is this new section called aggregation rule. And what this means is for this guy, for this role, when you give it to other people, you can give this to other people, or you can reuse a built-in one. This aggregation rule, which means that this label that you're going to put onto any other cluster role if it's marked as true, then this guy will take the details of this role and add it to this role. So, for example, let me show you the aggregate that actually does it. So you have that role, and then you have this role, which is allows you to, I'm saying in this CRD, which is the fan CRD, which is from a demo I gave a couple of weeks ago, you have get, listen, watch on fans in the API group of CRD Merrill.io, right? Because Kubernetes doesn't know about, I made this up, right? So out of the box, a lot of the roles don't know about this, or I can make a new role and I can use the aggregator to take this and add it to it. So in our example, we're going to make a new role. We don't want to mess with any existing roles because this is the demo and people are using my cluster. So I'm just going to make a role on the side and a cluster role on the side. But you could do this with an existing role. So you can see here the label is matching the aggregate, what to aggregate on. That was defined in the other cluster role. So which means that these rules here, right, are going to get added to this cluster role here, this aggregation role. So which means, so I applied both of these guys here. And let's look at the binding. So the binding is just given to me, which means take the role that we were talking about before, the cluster role of test. I named it test. Here, I'll show you it's named test. See, it's named test. There it is. And you can see that I'm going to add for my user, michael.merrill@bondage.com, I'm going to bind that user to the cluster role test. This is the cluster role binding. So I applied all this stuff. So let's do kubectl get cluster role binding, and we're going to grep on test, right? And my cluster role should already be there. And you have test and you have test aggregate. Remember, there's two, because the aggregate actually defines, has the label that is being, this guy has the selector, and this is the one that you want to give to the bindings, and this one has a selector that tells you which label to look for and the other cluster roles to include. And this guy actually uses the label and lists out the roles. So if I do kubectl get cluster role, let's look at this guy, test-o JSON. You can see that it actually included all the stuff from the other guy, right? So that's cool. You can see the aggregator, it matched this label here. Now on the let's see, what's the test aggregate? Okay, let's look at the other one, test aggregate. Now this one doesn't actually get given out to people. But you could give it out to people, but it's not really the point, because it doesn't. It's not the one that's going to be dynamic. The dynamic one is going to be the one that's test, because it's got the selector on it, and it's going to go through and it's going to append to this rule section all the other cluster roles that have the label. So the reason why you want to do this, is because. Give out the one with the selector on it, because tomorrow if I want to make a new cluster role with different permissions, I just have to give it the label and it will automatically get included into the one that I've already given out to users. And I don't have to change the RBAC bindings because they're already in place, and they will be dynamically updated with the permissions for the cluster roles that contain the magic label in them. So it's kind of like permissions discovery in a way. Which is kind of neat. So we're going to leverage that. I'm going to show you guys what I'm going to do. I'm going to delete this stuff. Let me go back here so I can show you guys that I don't have permission. I don't have permission to this stuff, so I want to delete it. I'm the admin right now, so I'm going to do kubectl. So I need to be the admin to do cluster role stuff. So I'm going to delete cluster role binding test. Oh, cluster role and test aggregate. And what was my binding called? It was called test binding. So let me delete the cluster role binding called test binding. Okay, and I'm gonna do use user michael.merrill@farmers.com. So now I don't have any permissions to see anything. So if I do if I try to look at the CRD, which is a thing called fans, it'll say you don't have permission to see it. See, so I don't have permissions to see fans.crd.emerald.io, which is okay, which is what we want. That's not working. So you can see if I'm a user, me history. If I'm the user of this guy, if I switch users to the admin user, I should be able to see it. Okay. And there's my fan. So I have a new fan in there. So you can see that the admin has permission to see it because the admin is the cluster admin. And the cluster admin, well, actually more than the cluster admin. It's not the built-in cluster admin. This user that I just switched to is like the Uber administrator ultimate user password. So we're gonna go back to we're gonna use this user. And we're going to create the cluster. So you saw that when I logged in with my personal user, it didn't work. So we're going to do kubectl apply. Well, the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to create the role that we're going to give out to people. This one. -f. Oh. This one, test cluster role. Okay. And then we're going to give the aggregate, all right? Which will actually append the permissions for the CRD to that role. But this hasn't been given to anybody yet. It has been bound to anybody yet, so let's bind it to myself. Kubectl apply -f. Let's bind it to me. I'm gonna bind it to me. Okay, and now if I use my user, then run kubectl get fans, it'll work. And there I am. So you can see the new fan. Let's look at. So now I have permission to say get on this stuff. But if you saw, I didn't have permission to do any kind of updates. So I can prove that to you by looking at the test cluster role aggregate here. It was just get, list, and watch. So if I try to do a edit on this guy, edit fan, new fan, right? It's not gonna let me do this. So if I'm gonna change me being a football fan to the Eagles, right? It's not gonna let me do that. See, I don't have permission to do that. So I can't do patch. So it tried to do a patch on the resource, and I don't have permission to do it. So let's change it. Let's switch to the other user because I need to change a cluster role, and my user doesn't have permission to change cluster roles. So okay. So now let's look at the cluster role aggregate. And this is where we would do a. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this. I'm going to take this whole thing. I'll make another one to show you guys how it gets picked up using the selector. Aggregate -2 YAML. Okay. 2. Okay, and then we're gonna do, what was it? I don't know if it's update or patch. I'm gonna put both in here. Okay. So, and then we need to apply this, right? Okay, so keep our fingers crossed. What should happen is if I look at the kubectl get cluster role on test now, it should have the patch and the update, and it does. So you see that it got updated dynamically. You saw that, and it's got this one and fans. It's got okay, Interesting, interesting, interesting. Interesting in that I don't see the other ones. Let's look at, what did I do? I had get, list, and watch, right? Um, I wonder what happened to get, list, and watch. I'm gonna have to, well, unless it's implied, or there was like an issue with that or something. I don't know. Let's say, hmm. So if I do this, so, oh, I know why. I know why. Because the name of the cluster role binding is the same when I copied it. So if I do this, kubectl edit, I'm going to do this, kubectl RBI. We'll just go back to this one because I overwrote it. So we'll just say test aggregate -1. That's why. And I'll just apply that again. Silly me. Okay. Okay. So now if I do the cluster role, you'll see. Okay, get, list, and watch are there as well as patch and load. So they're all there now. Okay. So awesome. Yeah. Nothing like a live demo. So going back here, okay, so now you see I have get, list, and watch. So let me switch my user to the user that I had before, which is my personal user, right? Now I should have permission to go through and edit this stuff. Rep, edit. So let me edit the new fan. And we're going to change this guy to Eagles, even though, you know, I can't do that. I'm going to have to say Jets. Okay. So, and then it says that, yeah, well, I had permission to do this. It says it's not valid because, because I have a, this is interesting. From my last demo, this is interesting. I had an open API enforcement. So if you remember in CRDs, the spec section is kind of like open form. And one of the most recent additions to that was the ability to have an open API validation enforcement. So that's what that is. And if you remember from last time, you can only be a certain number of teams. And I think my demo last time was if you try to put in Eagles, it wouldn't let you put in Eagles. So I tried to put in or Eagles or Jets or whatever. Well, one of them, I have to go and see like what the open validation is. I think it's Eagles. Okay. Yep. It is Eagles. Let me go back here and I'll show you guys. It's Eagles is an accepted. Jets is not an accepted one. So I changed it to Eagles and it worked. So let's edit new fan. You got Giants. So if I change this to Eagles, Eagles, and it says new fan was not valid. Blah blah blah. Validation failure. Spec football body should match Giants. So I can only do Giants in the football. So we'll leave that as Giants. We'll change the Mets to Mets too. Let me quit out of here. I forgot about all the open API stuff I had in there. So if I say Yankees here for baseball, there. You can see that. So the reason why it was spitting out of me was again because I had open API validation, and you're only allowed to put in Giants as a favorite football team. And for baseball, it was open, so I just changed baseball to Yankees. So you can see that I have permission now to go in there and change it, whereas before I didn't. And all I had to do was create another cluster role binding, give it that magic annotation up top, and it would get picked up by the cluster role binding that was looking for or discovering those other cluster roles that have that, not cluster role binding, cluster roles that have that annotation. And it would get picked up automatically and applied to the users. So what that frees me up from is having to exhaustively go through for every group of users in every project, for any kind of special permissions they needed, to go through and exhaustively list out new cluster roles and cluster role bindings, or role bindings rather, because it's namespace specific, um, in every namespace. It was just crazy. So I was ending up, and we only have a couple of teams working on this. So you can imagine if you're in an enterprise and you have hundreds of teams working, you end up with like thousands of cluster role bindings and cluster roles and role bindings and roles. So this eliminates all that. So this is big news for me. Much easier to administer all this stuff. So yeah, that's it. So I figured it would take about a half hour. It took me exactly a half hour to go through all this. I'm just gonna go through. I don't know if you guys have any questions. Let me go through over here and see if you guys do. I mean, I know there's a challenge. I say this every week. There's a challenge with going through and posting questions on here, and there's nothing I can do about that because I don't control your access into Google applications and what they can do. But if you want, you just send me a shout out through email or HipChat or Slack, or send me a text or whatever, and I can answer any of your questions about this stuff. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this. So this is a really big pain point of mine. I wanted to talk about this. So really excited because we just upgraded our cluster to 1.9. And this is one of the new features in 1.9. So I will quickly jump on this and start using it, because as more teams start to use the clusters that we have, it just makes management of their permissions so much easier. And that's it. So you guys have a great weekend. Next week, hopefully I'll have something just as practical as I do today. I think today's lesson is really practical. A break from last week. Last week we did a break. We talked about some Go stuff last week. We talked about vanity domains last week, and that was really just like a quick drive-by. Hey, this is a pretty cool thing that Go does. I thought it was interesting. You know, it took me a couple hours or even days to wrap my head around what was going on with the vanity domains, but once you see it, it's pretty cool. But today's was really practical in that I showed you guys a new feature in Kubernetes 1.9 that really makes administration super easier to do and less exhaustive. It makes administration and management of those RBAC permissions much easier. So Kubernetes 1.11 is out. It is an alpha release, I think, right now. And 1.10 is also out in stable release. So my team is actually already engaged on upgrading to 1.10. Now, some exciting things with 1.10 that we're pretty excited about is the ability using cops to upgrade to etcd version 2 in the backend. So that'll be cool when we get that, because then you get all the gRPC improvements and HTTP2 improvements, and you'll be able to exponentially process more workloads with your etcd cluster. So any concerns that we may have with performance will go out the window, because hopefully the etcd, the binary protocols that will be used for the API calls will be that much faster. So that's what's on the horizon for us. And if you guys have any questions, just send us any notes, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.